Hey, welcome back. It's good to have you here again tonight. Before anything else, take a breath. A long, slow, deliberate breath. Air filling your chest until there is no more room, and then a quiet, unhurried exhale that releases the last remnants of the evening. Let the tension in your shoulders fall away. Let your hands grow heavy wherever they have settled. Let the ceiling above you blur at the edges of your focus, and if your eyes are already closed, let your thoughts slow down just a fraction of a degree. You don't need to figure anything out tonight. You don't need to perform or produce or be present in any demanding way. Tonight, all you have to do is listen. And if you drift away partway through, if sleep comes for you before I finish speaking, then that is exactly the right thing. That is the whole point. The words will keep going, my voice will keep moving, and you simply have to let it all carry you wherever rest needs to take you. Tonight we're going to talk about Hornet. We're going to trace the full and complete arc of her story, where she came from, who she is, what she carries, and where she is going. She is one of the most layered characters in the entire Hollow Knight universe, and her journey in Silksong reveals dimensions of her that the first game could only suggest. Hers is a story about inheritance and identity, about the weight of being a child shaped by choices made before her birth, about arriving in a land that is broken and finding within yourself the will to try to mend it anyway. It is a story told in silk and shadow, in needle strikes and quiet endurance, in the kinds of choices that have no perfect answer. And it is, like all the best stories, ultimately a story about who you decide to be when no one has given you a clear answer about who you ought to be. Settle deeper into wherever you are resting tonight. Let your body find its heaviness. Let your breathing slow, just a little. You are exactly where you need to be. There is nowhere else to be right now. No other version of this moment more correct or more necessary than this one. Just here, just quiet. Just these words and your breathing and the slow, reliable weight of a body that needs rest and is being allowed to have it. If these quiet stories help you find rest, please take a moment to leave a like on this video. It's a small gesture, but it genuinely helps these words find the other people lying awake somewhere in the dark, searching for the same stillness you're looking for right now. And if you'd like to leave a comment letting me know where you're resting tonight, what city, what country, what corner of the world, please do. There is something deeply comforting about knowing that across so many different time zones, so many different rooms, so many different lives, people are falling asleep to these same words at the same time. And if you'd like to come back again, subscribe so this space is always waiting for you whenever you need it. Now, let's begin. To understand Hornet's story fully, you have to go further back than most people do. You have to resist the temptation to start with Hallownest, because Hallownest is not the beginning of her story. It is not even close to the beginning. To understand who Hornet is and what she carries, every layer of her, the precision and the guardedness and the loneliness, and the extraordinary capability and the quality that makes her show up at the crucial moments even when no one asked her to. You have to go back to before Hallownest, back to before Deepnest, back to a kingdom older than either of those places, a kingdom built on stone and silence and the endless sacred labour of weaving, a kingdom whose name carries the weight of everything that happened there and everything that is still happening because of it. You have to go back to Pharloom. Pharloom is a kingdom unlike Hallownest in almost every sense. Where Hallownest was built by a pale worm who shed one form to become another, who carried the light of civilization in his palm and pressed it into the minds of insects who had previously known only instinct, Pharloom was already ancient before the Pale King ever arrived in his lands. There was no single founding event, no single figure who sat down and decided what Pharloom would be. It accreted. It grew the way old things grow, through accumulation and succession, each generation inheriting the structures of the last and adding something of their own, until the kingdom became the kind of dense and layered place that takes lifetimes to comprehend. The pilgrimage routes that run through it are worn smooth by centuries of devoted feet. The towers of the citadel rise so high they disappear into clouds that never fully clear. The religious system woven through every aspect of the culture is so old that the people participating in it have largely forgotten the original reason it was created and now simply practice it, because it has always been practiced. Because stopping would feel like tearing out a thread and watching the entire fabric unravel. In Pharloom, the fundamental organising principle of existence is silk. Not simply as a resource or a craft or a luxury, silk is power there. Silk is identity. Silk is the thing around which the culture, the religion, the economy and the social hierarchy all revolve. It is woven into the architecture of the citadel in physical patterns that carry meaning readable only to those trained in their interpretation. It is present in the practices of the physicians who treat the bodies of Pharloom's inhabitants. It is the thread that connects the living to the dead, the present to the past, the ordinary to the sacred. To live in Pharloom is to live in silk, to be surrounded by it, to have it embedded in the culture so completely that its presence becomes invisible, the way water's presence is invisible to something that has never known anything other than water. And at the source of all that silk, at the absolute origin point of everything that makes Pharloom what it is a single, higher being, whose name is spoken in the prayers of pilgrims and drawn in thread patterns on the oldest walls of the oldest sanctuaries, Grandmother Silk. She arrived in Pharloom the way powerful things arrive in that universe, suddenly, completely, displacing whatever had been there before without particular ceremony or apology. The kingdoms that preceded her were absorbed into new shapes, remade by her presence the way clay is remade by an insistent hand. She was vast and difficult to comprehend, a higher being in the truest sense, something that existed at a scale that made the world of smaller creatures seem very small and very temporary and very much in need of perspective. She was ancient in a way that makes the ordinary meaning of that word feel insufficient. She had been wherever she had been for so long that Pharloom, this specific place, this particular arrangement of stone and earth and creature, was simply her most recent accommodation. At the centre of her power was silk. Silk that she produced, silk that she controlled, silk that she could use to elevate simple creatures from the state of animal instinct into something approaching reason, approaching identity, approaching the capacity for worship. She could thread her silk through a creature and fundamentally alter what that creature was. Not superficially, not a costume change, not a new set of behaviours imposed from outside. The alteration was structural. She rewrote what the creature could be by threading herself into what it was. And this was what she wanted. Not companionship exactly, not love as smaller creatures understand it in the ordinary way, but something in that direction. She wanted beings who were hers, who existed because of her, who called her mother and meant it, who built their lives around her the way civilizations build their lives around a river they depend on, with a love that is inseparable from need. She was lonely in the way that powerful and ancient things are lonely, not from lack of contact, but from lack of anything that could actually see her, actually know her, actually meet her at a level of comprehension that would make the meeting feel like connection, rather than an exchange between enormously mismatched scales. She had power beyond measure. She had existence beyond ordinary duration. But she did not have anyone to belong to, and she did not have anyone who belonged to her, and in the hollow space of that absence she carried something that, in smaller creatures, we would call grief. She could not have children in the biological sense. That avenue was closed to her, whether by her nature or by the specific character of what she was. And so she did what powerful things tend to do when confronted with the desire they cannot satisfy through natural means. She engineered a substitute. She made something instead. She took the Pharlids, small, unassuming arachnid creatures, six-limbed, six-eyed, living in the dark burrows of Pharloom on instinct alone, eating and sleeping and reproducing in the simple rhythms of animal existence, innocent of language or meaning or the capacity to wonder about their own condition. She took them, and she did with her silk what her silk could do. She elevated them, she expanded them. She pressed something new and sharp and luminous into the spaces where simple instinct had previously lived alone, and in doing so she fundamentally changed what those creatures could be. She gave them consciousness, she gave them language, she gave them the ability to produce silk of their own, channeling through their smaller bodies a fraction of the primordial power that lived in her, making them capable of something that almost no other creature anywhere could do. And she told them they were hers. She told them they were her children. She told them they were divine, not gods themselves, but the daughters of a god, shaped from something holy, given life by a being whose silk was older than the kingdom they stood in, and that this origin made them special, made them sacred, made them owed to her in a way that was also a gift. She framed the debt as love. She framed the ownership as family. She built the relationship she wanted by constructing the framework that would generate it, and she did it so thoroughly that for a very long time no one questioned whether the framework was what she said it was. She called these elevated creatures the weavers. Close your eyes, if they're not already closed. Breathe in slowly, and as you breathe out, imagine the earliest days of the weavers, the very beginning of what they were. A tribe of women, all of them six-eyed and strong, all of them capable of producing silk from within their own bodies. A scarce and extraordinary ability that set them apart from every other creature in Pharloom and gave them significance within the kingdom that they had not possessed before Grandmother Silk arrived. They built their culture around the sacred thread. They learned to weave stories in silk, histories encoded in patterns, whole libraries of memory stored not on stone or parchment, but in textiles that only a weaver could fully read. The patterns were not decoration. They were language, precise and dense and carrying information that could be passed across generations, as long as someone remained who knew how to interpret them. They built the great citadel at the centre of Pharloom, or at least they built the predecessor to what the citadel would eventually become, the structure that would be added to over centuries until it reached the clouds, until it became the organising centre of the kingdom's religious and political life. They served Grandmother Silk from within it, creating the religious order that would define Pharloom for so long that the order became indistinguishable from the kingdom itself. Pilgrims came from distant lands to make the ascent, to sing in the great sanctuaries, to offer their devotion upward in the direction of the sacred height where Grandmother Silk was understood to dwell. The citadel was always busy with that kind of energy, the energy of people who believed that their presence mattered, that their songs were heard, that going to this place and doing this thing connected them to something larger than their ordinary lives. And for a time, everything was as Grandmother Silk told the weavers it should be. They were her children, they were chosen. They were the mediators between her and the rest of Pharloom, the ones who understood the sacred material at a level no other creatures could approach, the ones whose purpose was defined and dignified and tied to something that felt genuinely like meaning. They had gone from animals in the dark to the daughters of a god. The gratitude that accompanied that transformation was real. The devotion it generated was real. The culture they built around the silk was real and beautiful and complex, and, in the way that genuine cultures are, irreducible to the circumstances that produced it, even if the circumstances were engineered. But the weavers were, above all things, intelligent. And intelligence tends, given enough time and enough quiet, to ask uncomfortable questions. That is the nature of consciousness when it has been given enough room. It investigates. It probes the edges of what it has been told. It notices inconsistencies. It holds one piece of information next to another piece of information, and observes what they produce when compared. You cannot create a thinking thing and then be surprised when it thinks, and you cannot create a thinking thing with the capacity for genuine loyalty, and then be surprised when it wants to know whether its loyalty is freely given or structurally compelled. The question that began to unravel everything was simple on the surface and devastating beneath it. Were they truly her children? Not metaphorically, not elevated, not honoured, not raised to something more than they had been, not connected to a higher being who called them daughters and meant it in some meaningful sense, but children in the fundamental way that the word implied. Wanted, desired for themselves, generated from love rather than from need. Was the relationship they had with Grandmother Silk a relationship of genuine family, or was it a very sophisticated and emotionally convincing arrangement that produced family-shaped behaviour in both directions, while the underlying mechanics were something else entirely? It was the kind of question that, once asked aloud, could not be taken back. And when they began to investigate, when they looked clearly at the evidence of their own origins, at what Grandmother Silk actually was, and what she had actually done in creating them, the answer that came back was not what any of them had hoped it would be. They were not her biological children. They could not be. She did not work that way. They were creations. Elevated from animals, yes, imbued with her silk and her power, and something she called love, but which, when examined honestly, was closer to ownership with affection attached. They had been made the way you make a garden or a monument or a beautiful and intricate piece of art, not because the thing itself was the point, but because the maker needed something to justify their existence. Something to show for the immense span of time through which they had been existing without purpose. They were her audience and her creation simultaneously. The religion built around her was not truly a gift given to the weavers. It was a mechanism designed to sustain her, to keep her fed on the worship she required the way ordinary beings require food or water. Their prayers did not simply rise upward out of free devotion. They were captured. They were used. The weavers were beautiful flowers growing in a garden Grandmother Silk maintained for her own purposes, and the fertility of the garden depended on the flowers not looking too closely at the soil. When the weavers understood this, the rebellion was not a choice so much as a necessity. They were not simply angry, though anger was present. They were also grieving. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from discovering that the thing you believed in most was not what you believed it was. Not a simple lie, but something more complicated, a mixture of performance and genuine feeling that is inseparable from self-interest, that cannot be untangled. Grandmother Silk, in her way, did love the weavers. She did want them. But what she wanted was not what she had allowed them to believe she wanted, and the difference between those two things was the difference between freedom and captivity dressed in comfortable clothes. The rebellion was led, in its earliest and most decisive phase, by a figure known only as the First Sinner. The name is a title, a designation given after the fact by those who remembered what she did, the first weaver to name what had been done to them, and declare that it was unacceptable, that they would not continue to exist within it, that the relationship as it had been constructed must end. The details of her true name have been lost, swallowed by the centuries between then and the present time, but what she did is remembered in every weaver tradition that survived. She gathered the weavers who were willing to act, and she organised what became the central act of the rebellion, not as a war, because a direct confrontation of power against power would not have served them, would have been suicidal in the most straightforward sense. Grandmother Silk at full strength, fully conscious, fully directing her will against them, would have been something they could not overcome by force alone. The First Sinner understood this. She planned accordingly. The rebellion would not be a battle, it would be a trick. A patient, elaborate, extraordinarily dangerous trick that would require the cooperation of every weaver who remained, sustained over a period of time during which failure was always possible, sustained through the specific combination of discipline and understanding and willingness to endure that the weavers had been building across the generations of their existence. They would lull Grandmother Silk to sleep, not a natural sleep, not simply waiting for her to rest. They would use her own hunger for worship against her. They would create conditions in which her need to be worshipped became the mechanism of her undoing, in which the devotion she had spent so long cultivating became the substance that carried her into the deepest of slumbers rather than the sustenance that kept her alert and powerful. And when she slept, they would seal her in the cradle, a structure built specifically for this purpose at the very summit of the citadel, designed to contain the weight of her unconscious body, to hold her dreaming rather than waking, to turn the place of her greatest power into the place of her greatest constraint. The plan required sacrifice. It required the weavers who remained at the citadel to maintain, indefinitely and across generations, a religious system that served a purpose those outside the innermost circle of knowledge would never know. The pilgrims who came to the citadel, who walked the long roads from their distant homes, who sang in the great sanctuaries, who offered their devotion upward in the direction of the sacred height, these pilgrims believed their worship was freely received by a great and holy being who heard them and was nourished by their faith in the way that a god is nourished by faith. They did not know that their prayers were being captured by the weavers who remained, redirected, channeled not into the being they intended to reach, but into the seal that contained her. Their song sustained Grandmother Silk in her slumber rather than in her waking. Their devotion was the lock she slept behind. It was a deception of extraordinary dimension. It was also the only option. When the thing you must contain is powerful enough to make reality bend to her will when fully conscious, the only leverage you have is the time between her waking breath and the next one. You use what you have. The weavers used the system Grandmother Silk herself had built, the pilgrimage, the songs, the channeling of devotion, and they quietly, carefully, at enormous personal cost, turned it into a mechanism that served the opposite purpose from what it appeared to serve. It was not comfortable, it was not honest, but it was necessary. the way all sacrifices made under impossible circumstances are necessary, not because there was no cost, but because the alternative were something worse. Let the image of that sit gently in your mind. Not the drama of it, not the tension, just the shape of it. People doing something hard and costly and morally ambiguous because there was no clean option available, because someone had to hold the weight, and they were the ones with the knowledge and the capability to hold it. Because walking away from something just because others don't know you're doing it would mean letting the worst possible outcome happen unchallenged. That's what the weavers who stayed were doing. They held the weight that nobody saw. They maintained a system that required sustaining across lifetimes, across generations, across the accumulation of years and deaths, and the inevitable erosion of institutional knowledge that comes when something must be preserved through teaching rather than written record. They held it as long as they could. But not all the weavers stayed. Some of them left. They packed whatever belonging a weaver could carry. Their knowledge, their silk, the patterns of their culture woven into lengths of thread they wrapped around their bodies like armour and like history. And they fled Pharloom entirely. They were refugees in the truest sense. They were people who had discovered that the place they'd called home was built on a lie so fundamental that staying meant participating in the lie indefinitely, and leaving meant losing everything familiar while gaining the one thing no amount of comfort can substitute for: the ability to look clearly at what you are and what you're doing and find it honest. They sought out places far enough from Grandmother Silk's reach that they might build something new, something genuinely theirs, unentangled from the silk of a higher being who claimed to love them but had engineered them for her own purposes and could not easily be persuaded to stop. They wanted mornings that were not owed to anyone. They wanted the particular and astonishing freedom of not mattering to anything larger than themselves, at least for long enough to figure out who they actually were when no enormous presence was organising their identity around its needs. They wanted to discover what the weavers would become if becoming was actually up to them. Some of those weavers, some of the ones who fled, found their way to Deepnest. Let your breathing slow a little more. Ease the muscles in your face. Let your thoughts follow the image of those weavers arriving in the deep earth, strong and weary and carrying everything that mattered on their bodies, and choosing to make their home in the dark. Deepnest was already an old and dangerous place. A kingdom of its own that predated the Pale King's arrival in Hallownest. A place of deep, cold earth and ancient creatures and darkness so complete it had its own character, its own kind of weight. It was in almost every way the antithesis of the citadel they had fled. No towering spires, no sacred light filtering through stone, no architecture reaching towards something it believed was holy. Just earth and dark and creatures who'd been living in these tunnels through enough time to have become entirely adapted to what those tunnels required of them. Perhaps that was exactly what the weavers needed. A place that made no demands. A place where nothing owed them anything, and they owed nothing to anything outside themselves. Somewhere that did not already have a meaning assigned to it that they would have to navigate around or participate in or maintain. Somewhere they could begin. In Deepnest, the weavers built a different kind of life, more withdrawn than what they had known in Pharloom, more focused on individual capability and the bonds between individuals rather than on systems and structures and the maintenance of sacred institutions. They had learned from what happened in Pharloom that grandeur and religious hierarchy had a cost that was not immediately visible, that systems built to serve a purpose could be turned, could be used against the people operating within them, could become mechanisms of control in the hands of something with enough power and enough self-interest. They chose simplicity instead. They chose strength. They chose a culture that was tight-knit and demanding and honest, in a way that the Citadel had stopped being, built around what individual weavers could actually do, and the bonds that formed between people who knew each other truly and were known truly in return. They kept their silk. They kept their skills. They kept the patterns encoded in their tradition. But they rebuilt the framework of their lives from the ground up, on terms they chose themselves, for reasons they could each account for. Over time, as generations passed in Deepnest, as the weavers were absorbed into that dark ecology and absorbed it in return, they became something that was both continuous with the weavers of Pharloom and genuinely new. The silk they produced developed differently, shaped by different demands. The darkness required adaptation, and the weaver silk adapted. Their fighting style, always centered on the needle and the thread, became something shaped by the specific topography of Deepnest, by the creatures they encountered there, by the combination of tradition and necessity that produces the best martial cultures. They were still weavers. But they were Deepnest weavers. They had made themselves something specific to the place that had given them shelter. One of those weavers, one of the ones who thrived in Deepnest, who did not merely survive there but rose to something that might be called greatness, became queen. Her name was Hera the Beast. Hera ruled Deepnest with the kind of authority that comes not from inherited title, but from genuine power, genuine intelligence, and the absolute willingness to act on both without flinching at the cost. She was formidable in the ways that mattered. She had the strength and the skill and the presence that made creatures inclined to defer to whoever carried it, and she had the intelligence to ensure that deference was warranted rather than simply demanded. Deepnest under her rule maintained its independence even as the Pale King's influence expanded through the territories above. She negotiated with him. She made the treaty with the Mantis Lords that secured Deepnest's border. She did not permit Hallownest's reach to extend into her kingdom, and the Pale King, whatever his broader plans, whatever his frustrations, accepted that limit. That was Hera's Deepnest. A sovereign dark that answered to nothing above. And then the infection came, and the Pale King's plan was failing. The Hollow Knight, sealed in the Temple of the Black Egg, was not empty enough, had thoughts, had feelings, had looked at the Pale King with something like love, and that tiny crack in the emptiness had been enough. The radiance found it. The infection began to spread. The kingdom the Pale King had built with everything he had, with thousands of his own children's lives, with the eternal sleep of 3 higher beings, with the sacrifice of the Hollow Knight's freedom, was coming apart despite all of it. And the Pale King grew desperate in the particular way of someone who has already spent everything they had and is being asked to spend more. He needed 3 dreamers. He needed 3 higher beings to place themselves in eternal sleep, their consciousness bound into the maintenance of the seal on the Hollow Knight. He already had Lurien the Watcher, who agreed out of the absolute devotion he felt for his king, a devotion so complete it swept aside every consideration of personal cost, transformed eternal sleep into an honour rather than a sacrifice. He already had Monomon the Teacher, who agreed because she understood the problem clearly and calculated that this solution, for all its flaws, was better than the alternatives, who made her preparations with characteristic, methodical care, gave Quirrell the mask that would protect him from the infection and from grief, and then sealed herself away with the same quiet logic she brought to every other problem she ever faced. But he still needed a third, and the third he needed was Hera. He came to her not as a king issuing a demand. He came as someone who needed something, which was a different posture entirely, and Hera was too intelligent not to understand the difference and to use it. She was a queen. She was not a subject of Hallownest. He could not compel her. He could only ask and accept whatever terms she set, because the alternative, not having her, failing to complete the seal, was something he could not accept. And Hera, looking at him clearly the way she looked at everything and everyone clearly, understood that this was the moment to negotiate for the only thing she had always wanted and never had the right opening to secure. She wanted a child, not a vessel, not a product of whatever unusual processes the Pale King used to generate his other descendants. A real child, one who would carry both kingdoms in them, who would carry Deepnest's heritage and the Pale King's complicated legacy, who would be strong enough and complicated enough and real enough to survive what it meant to belong to both. An heir. Someone who would exist after Hera was gone, who would carry the Deepnest Weaver's tradition forward, who would be proof that Hera's life had produced something permanent. The Pale King agreed, and so Hornet was born of that bargain, born of a queen's negotiation and a king's desperation, born as the product of a political agreement that was also, in its precise and unsentimental way, an act of profound love. Because Hera loved Deepnest, and she loved the idea of what would come after her, and she spent the entire remainder of her life on the chance of having it. Let your body sink. Let that thought settle. Hornet came into the world as the product of a political agreement, yes, but every origin story has its complications, and what the agreement meant was this: Hera traded her entire remaining future for Hornet's existence. Every morning she might have woken as queen, every choice she might have made with the years of her life that remained, every experience she might have had, good or difficult or ordinary, every day, every hour. She gave all of it, knowingly, with clear eyes, without being deceived about what the trade entailed. She knew she would become a dreamer immediately after Hornet was born. She knew she would not raise her daughter. She knew she would sleep, likely forever, her consciousness bound into a seal on a kingdom that was not hers, maintaining a solution she had played no part in creating. She made the trade anyway, because Hornet cost her everything, and she decided Hornet was worth it. Hornet did not get to know this directly. She grew up knowing that her mother was present somewhere in Deepnest, sleeping in the chamber where dreamers slept, unreachable through any conversation, not able to answer a question or notice something or offer any of the specific and irreplaceable things that only a mother can offer to a child who is becoming themselves. You cannot have a relationship with someone who is in eternal sleep the way you can with someone who is present. You can only know that they are there. You can only understand as fully as you are capable of understanding why they chose not to be. And if you are Hornet, who understands things clearly, who does not comfort herself with illusions, who looks at hard truths and holds them without flinching, then you understand that your mother made the right choice, or at least the choice she believed was right, and that this does not make the absence sting any less. Hornet was raised in the incomplete and complicated way that Hallownest's broken royal landscape managed these things, partly among the weavers of Deepnest who revered her, and partly with access to the White Lady, the Pale King's queen, the mother of all the vessels, who knew that Hornet was not her child in the same way any vessel was her child, but who offered what she could in the absence of Hera. The White Lady was herself carrying an enormous weight of guilt over the vessels, over the thousands of children who'd been created and discarded and killed in the abyss. She was not a simple presence, but in her way, in the gentle and complicated way of someone carrying a great burden who is nevertheless trying to be present for the people around them, she was there. Hornet grew up belonging to multiple places and belonging completely to none of them. She was a weaver, but she'd not grown up in Pharloom or in the deepest weaver traditions of Deepnest's innermost communities. She'd grown up at the intersection of her mother's world and her father's world, learning from both without being fully formed by either. She was the daughter of the Pale King, but she was not a vessel, not made of void, not hollow in the way the Night and the Hollow Knight were hollow. She was alive. She was full of thought and feeling and will. She had a voice and used it, thoughts and expressed them, a future, and was allowed to have it in a way that her void-made siblings never were. She was connected to both Hallownest and Deepnest, and, through the weavers, to the long deep history of Pharloom, and she carried all three of those inheritances in her body, in her silk, in the way she moved and thought and chose to exist in the world. What she chose to do with all of that ultimately was duty, but a duty that was genuinely hers, not imposed, not engineered, but arrived at through the specific combination of her nature and her understanding and the particular things she had witnessed and concluded. Duty in the form of the Princess Protector, not Queen, because a crown is a category, and she was not ready to be defined by a category when she had not yet fully defined herself. But Protector, a word that implies movement, implies presence at the moments that matter, implies loyalty to the thing being protected rather than to the institution of the protection. In Hollow Night, she is the guardian of Hallownest's ruins. She watches over what remains not because she has been asked to, not because anyone is watching to see if she stays, not because staying earns her anything except the continuation of a vigil that has no certain end. She stays because she is the kind of person who stays, because walking away from something real, from a place where people lived and built and hoped and failed, from the physical evidence that all of that mattered even though it ended badly, would be a form of erasure she is not able to commit. The ruins are real. The history in them is real. Hornet witnesses it because witnessing is the minimum we owe to things that were once alive. And she watches for the night. The night arrives in Hallownest drawn by something they cannot fully account for, some instinct, some pull, some drive toward the place where they were born and discarded and from which they eventually escaped. They arrive small and silent and purposeful, in a way that doesn't yet have a clear object. And Hornet, who has been waiting and watching, who knows what the night is and what they might be capable of and what the situation ultimately requires, moves to intercept them. The first fight is a test. Hornet needs to know if the night has the strength for what lies ahead. She cannot simply tell them. Telling someone they are strong enough is not the same as proving it to them, and proving it requires a test where failure has weight. She fights them with full intention, needle precise, using silken speed and the combat style she has spent her entire life developing until it is less a technique than an expression of her character. And when the knight proves themselves capable, when they demonstrate through the only proof that matters in combat, which is survival, she lets them continue. She appears throughout their journey at the crucial points. She is not a constant companion. She does not explain everything, does not hold their hand, does not protect them from the difficulties that are necessary for their growth. She appears when her presence matters and then she steps back, because that is how Hornet understands good guardianship. not as something that removes difficulty, but as something that ensures the person navigating the difficulty isn't entirely without witness. When they finally reach the Temple of the Black Egg, when the knight breaks the seal and enters to face the Hollow Knight, Hornet is there. She's been waiting for this, has been holding the thread of preparation across the entire arc of the knight's journey through Hallownest, and in the sealed siblings ending, in the ending where the knight takes on the Radiance's corruption, sealing it within themselves, Hornet enters the temple behind them and seals herself in. She closes the door on herself. She chooses containment. She becomes the new anchor, the new lock, the continuation of the sacrifice that started with the Dreamers and the Hollow Knight, and now extends to include the Princess Protector of Hallownest, who chose it with full understanding, who was not surprised by it because she had always known it was a possibility, who looked at the necessity and said, as she always does when she sees something necessary, yes, that is where Hollow Knight leaves her, sealed away with her purpose achieved and her future forfeit. And then she wakes in a cage. This is where Silksong begins, and the transition matters. Between the moment of sealing and the moment of waking in Pharloom, something occurred that the game does not explain in simple terms. She was taken. Outsider bugs, creatures with knowledge of who she was and resources sufficient to do something about it, moving with clear intention and evident purpose, transported her from the ruins of Hallownest to this unfamiliar kingdom. She did not go willingly. She wakes in confinement, in a cage in a place she has never been, surrounded by the sounds and sights and smells of a world that is entirely unlike anything in her experience. And then she does what she always does, she gets out. Starting from the beginning of Silksong, Hornet moves through Pharloom with needle in hand, and with the accumulated capability of everything she has ever trained to be. Her combat style has been refined through the years of guarding Hallownest. She's faster, more precise, more instinctively creative in the application of silk and needle than the knight's first encounter with her might have suggested. She can use her silk to bind, to grapple, to generate explosive tension and release it against enemies. She can use her needle not just to strike, but to deflect, to ricochet, to navigate the architecture of the spaces she moves through with a fluency that goes beyond athletic competence into something that looks, from the outside, like she's having a conversation with the terrain. She moves upward. Pharloom's geography is organised vertically, with the citadel at the peak and the ascent organised around the pilgrimage routes that wind through the kingdom's various regions. The shape of the kingdom tells you where the answer lives. Hornet reads that shape and moves toward it, and almost immediately she encounters what Pharloom is becoming. The haunting is the name for what is happening to Pharloom, and understanding it is essential to understanding what Hornet must navigate. Grandmother Silk, sealed in the cradle at the summit of the citadel for so long that the original purpose of the sealing has been partially forgotten by those who maintain the system. Grandmother Silk is waking, not all at once, not in a single dramatic roar of consciousness returning to the world, slowly. The way something enormous moves when it has been still for a very long time, with immense effort, in small increments, each small increment of wakefulness sending something outward through the threads of silk that have been woven into the bodies of Pharloom's inhabitants across many generations of treatment by the Citadel's physicians. The physicians had used Grandmother Silk's silk as medicine. They had threaded it into the bodies of Pharloom's bugs, because silk, in this kingdom, was understood to heal, to strengthen, to connect, and it did all of those things, but it also made the recipients carriers of a thread that ran back to its source. When Grandmother Silk begins to wake, when the seal begins failing because the redirect of pilgrims' prayers has gradually degraded across generations of imperfectly transmitted knowledge, that thread becomes something else. It becomes a line of control. The dead rise, animated by silk that responds to a will that is not fully conscious, but is not fully absent. The living find themselves driven towards states of mind and courses of action that serve no purpose they can identify. Compulsions, aggressions, confusions that override their own intentions and route them towards something that serves the larger organism they are, without knowing it, partly connected to. Pharloom is being reclaimed from within. Its inhabitants are being slowly reorganized around the needs of a sleeping higher being who is in the process of waking up and does not fundamentally distinguish between her creations and her property. The haunting is not malice, or rather, it is not primarily malice. Malice requires consciousness, requires a directed intention to cause pain. Grandmother Silk is not fully conscious. The haunting is what happens when something enormous stirs in its sleep. The collateral damage of scale is suffering caused not by anyone's specific intention, but by the simple, inexorable fact that when something this large moves, everything around it is affected regardless of whether it wants to be affected. Hornet moves through all of this. Her silk is different from the silk that carries the haunting. It is weaver silk, shaped by generations of independence from Grandmother Silk's direct influence, developed in Deepnest into something with its own character and its own relationship to the world. She is not immune to the haunting, but she is less vulnerable than most of Pharloom's inhabitants, and she has the fighting capability to address what the haunting produces in a direct way, when direct action is what the moment requires. Rest here for a moment. Let your body be heavy. Let your breathing be slow. We're moving through the middle of a long story, and there is no urgency in the moving. You can rest inside the middle of it. You can let the details wash over you without tracking each one, without holding tight to any particular thread of it. The larger shape of it will remain even if the specific details go soft. The story holds itself whether or not you are actively holding it. Let your jaw unclench. Let the muscles along your temples release. Let your hands lie open wherever they are resting. There are pilgrims in Pharloom who continue their ascent even as the haunting spreads. They walk the roads in groups, singing their songs, offering their devotion to a sacred height that most of them will never actually see. The songs are beautiful in the way that songs sustained by genuine faith are always beautiful. Not because the theology behind them is sound, not because the system they're participating in is what they believe it is, but because the people singing them mean what they're expressing. The longing, the desire for connection to something larger, the hope that going to this place and doing this thing will link them to something that makes ordinary life feel less ordinary. That longing is real regardless of whether the system directing it is worthy of the faith invested in it. Hornet watches these pilgrims as she moves through the kingdom. She sees what they are doing. She understands, because of her heritage, the mechanics of the system in a way they never will. She knows that their songs are not freely received by a divine ear that hears them individually. She knows the redirect, how it works, what the weavers who built this system intended. She watches pilgrims who don't know any of this singing their way through a kingdom that is dying around them, and she does not feel contempt for their ignorance. She feels something more complicated, something in the direction of recognition. The weavers of Pharloom were in exactly this position once, doing something real and meaningful to them that was also, at the structural level, something they had never been told the full truth about. Being devoted to something that was using their devotion in ways they hadn't consented to. The pilgrims are doing the same thing. It is not their fault. It is the fault of a system built to conceal its actual mechanics from the people generating the energy that powers it. She meets the caretaker. The caretaker is a guardian of pilgrims in the most fundamental sense. Someone who has spent a long time in Pharloom, developing an understanding of the Citadel systems that goes far beyond the surface knowledge available to ordinary pilgrims, or even to most of the clergy. The caretaker knows what the pilgrims' songs are actually doing. The caretaker knows the history of the Weaver's Rebellion, the sealing of Grandmother Silk, the system built to maintain that sealing. And the caretaker knows what is failing, knows that the seal is degrading, knows that Grandmother Silk is waking, knows that the haunting is the consequence of that waking, and knows that whatever comes next will require someone with capabilities the caretaker does not possess and cannot develop. When Hornet arrives, when the caretaker encounters this person carrying Weaver Silk, fighting with a needle and thread in a style that speaks of a tradition older than anything in current Pharloom, moving upward with evident purpose and evident competence, there is recognition. Not certainty, not the relief of a solved problem, but recognition of the kind that says, this is the person the situation was waiting for. Or at least this is someone whose particular combination of heritage and skill and character gives them a better chance than anything else currently available. The caretaker offers knowledge. Hornet offers capability. Together they begin to understand, across many encounters and many pieces of accumulated information, what the options actually are as Hornet ascends toward the cradle, and whatever confrontation waits at its summit. And they are not alone in the space between them and that summit. Lace is there. Lace deserves careful attention, because she is one of the most interesting figures in the whole of this story, and misunderstanding her makes it too simple in a way that flattens everything she represents. She's not a villain. She's not purely an obstacle. She's a wound given consciousness, a mistake given enough time to become something more than the mistake that created her, and the arc she travels across Hornet's journey in Pharloom is quietly extraordinary. Grandmother Silk, after the Weavers rebelled, after the daughters she had made looked clearly at what had been done to them and said no, and fled, and left her alone in the citadel with the seal closing over her and the redirected prayers sustaining her slumber, did not simply accept the loss. She could not. The hunger for what she had wanted was not erased by the rebellion. It was inflamed by it. The Weavers had been the answer to her loneliness, and they had proven themselves unwilling to be that answer on her terms, and so she attempted another answer. She wove lace from her own silk, directly, without any intermediate creature, without the elevation of a pre-existing animal. Lace was made entirely of Grandmother Silk's own substance, given the appearance and the mind of a child, designed to be everything the Weavers had refused to remain: loyal, present, devoted without complication. A daughter who would not ask the uncomfortable question, because she had been built to find the uncomfortable question inconceivable. But Lace, built with consciousness, developed her own complications anyway. She lived. She experienced. She came to understand what she was, not intellectually, not from being told, but in the particular way that accumulated experience produces self-knowledge over time. She knew she was a substitute. She knew she'd been made to fill a space the Weavers left. She knew her appearance had been designed to have the quality of a child, because Grandmother Silk had wanted a child, and this was Grandmother Silk's solution to the problem of not being able to simply have one. And she carried all of this knowledge inside herself like something she could not put down and could not fully carry. It was too heavy for one thing and too much a part of her for another. She saw herself as broken. She said so in the way people say things they believe to be too obviously true to be worth disputing. Broken and crude, a rough approximation of what Grandmother Silk had been trying to create, not the daughters the weavers might have been if they had remained. She fought with extraordinary precision, with a gilded pin and a fencer's discipline, with the kind of technical skill that comes from training so deep it becomes instinct. That skill was real. What she had built in herself through the years of her existence was real, regardless of what produced her. But she struggled to hold both of those things, the competence and the self-contempt, without one of them overtaking the other. When Hornet arrives in Pharloom and begins ascending, Lace's function is clear. Block the stranger with the needle, prevent her from reaching the summit, protect Grandmother Silk's interests, which are the only interests Lace was made to protect. And so she does. She appears at critical points in Hornet's ascent, challenges her, fights her with seriousness and skill, and withdraws when the fight reaches its conclusion without a definitive result, retreating to fight another day higher up. But something accumulates across those encounters. Two people fighting each other repeatedly are learning each other, not in the way of friends exchanging information, not collaboratively, but in the way that genuine combat produces real knowledge of the person on the other side of it. You cannot fight someone seriously without understanding features of their character that no polite conversation would reveal. You learn their reflexes, their instincts, the choices they make under pressure, the things they protect and the things they sacrifice, the quality of their attention, whether they are the kind of person who looks clearly at what is in front of them or the kind who can be distracted from it. Hornet learns that Lace is not simply doing a job. There is something personal in her opposition, something that goes beyond function into a terrain of feeling that the function is a vehicle for. Lace learns that Hornet is not simply an invader or a historical threat to Grandmother Silk's interests. There is something in Hornet, something about the way she carries purpose without requiring anyone's permission, about the way she moves through a kingdom in crisis without being either overwhelmed by the crisis or callous toward it, that Lace does not have a fully adequate category for and keeps returning to despite herself. They are, without either of them having chosen it, becoming legible to each other, and becoming legible to someone is always the first step toward a complicated kind of bond. The confrontation at the cradle, when Hornet finally reaches the summit, when Grandmother Silk's presence becomes impossible to manage from a distance and must be met directly, is not simply a boss fight in the way the word implies something defeated and concluded. Grandmother Silk is a higher being waking from a long and violated sleep, and the scale of what that means is present in everything about the confrontation. She is vast, she is ancient, she is also genuinely suffering, the void that has been growing around the cradle, pressing against its exterior as Grandmother Silk presses against its interior from within, has trapped both of them in a kind of impossible tension that neither can resolve alone. She is not approaching this confrontation from a position of strength. She is pressing against the walls of something that is also pressing back, and the haunting, the spreading madness throughout Pharloom, is the expression of that struggle mapped onto every silk-threaded body in the kingdom. And at the moment of greatest danger, when Grandmother Silk, in her desperately pressing wakefulness, reaches for Hornet and tries to pull her into the void, Lace acts. She steps in. She does not step in for Hornet exactly. She steps in against Grandmother Silk, because Grandmother Silk wants this outcome, and Lace, in that specific moment of extreme pressure and crystallizing clarity, discovers that she will not permit Grandmother Silk to have what she wants. Not this, not after everything. The feelings Lace has been accumulating across her encounters with Hornet, the slowly developing recognition, the knowledge of something in Hornet that Lace does not have a word for but already values, that knowledge is present. But what finally moves her is something rawer and cleaner, and more fundamental than affection. It is will. It is the blunt assertion of herself against the being who made her, the first completely free choice of Lace's existence, arrived at through spite, which is perhaps the purest expression of autonomy that a creature engineered for compliance can initially access. Spite is not noble. It is not the language she will always speak. But right now, in this moment, it is freedom. Spite is Lace finally being, in the deepest way, her own thing rather than someone else's. Hornet fights the void-corrupted form that emerges from Lace after that intervention. Fights it not to destroy but to free, to pull the person back from the precipitation of what the void is making her, to separate what Lace is from what the void is working through her. It is a rescue executed through combat, which is the language Hornet knows best and has always known best. The language in which she expresses things that she cannot easily say in any other form. And then the night arrives from the void, the small, silent sibling, made of exactly the darkness that has been threatening both of them, moving through that darkness because the darkness is their home. They pull Hornet and Lace out. They do not explain how. The night never explains. They simply arrive in the dark places and do the impossible necessary thing, and do not make a story of it. 3 possible shapes for what comes after. 3 ways the confrontation with Grandmother Silk can resolve, and all of them are honest about what resolution looks like when the problem is this complex and this old. In one shape, Hornet becomes the seal. She uses her weaver silk to bind Grandmother Silk's power directly, becoming the living anchor of a containment that does not depend on redirected prayers or on knowledge preserved across generations that will inevitably degrade. She is the system. Her capability and her heritage and her specific character are the mechanism. She takes this on knowing what it means for her freedom, for her future. For every morning she will wake understanding that she is bound to this duty until she is not. It is not a triumphant ending. It is the ending of someone who has seen a weight that has no one else to carry it, and has enough character to say, "Then I will carry it." In this shape of the ending, Hornet is most like Hera, giving up a self-determined future for something she has decided matters more. In a second shape, the void corruption that has been threading through Hornet, present in some form before or during the events of Silksong, something she's been carrying without fully knowing its dimensions, will not be contained. It overwhelms her. It takes her and Grandmother Silk both, devours them in the darkness. This ending is a tragedy, not a moral failure, not a failure of will or skill or character, just the particular tragedy of discovering that something inside you is larger than your ability to manage it, that an inheritance you didn't know you were fully carrying turns out to be decisive at the worst possible moment. The Hollow Knight universe does not flinch from this kind of ending. It names it as a real possibility because it is a real possibility, because sometimes the darkness wins, and the person who faced it honestly deserved better, but did not receive it. In a third shape, the shape that requires the most, that has the highest cost in terms of what must be found and understood and brought to bear, Hornet and the Caretaker find an alternative. Not a new seal, not a consumption, something different. A trap designed specifically for Grandmother Silk's nature, using what the Caretaker knows about the Citadel's systems and what Hornet carries in her weaver silk to create a solution that does not require Hornet's permanent sacrifice, that does not bind her to an eternal vigil, that might, genuinely might, allow Pharloom to begin the process of becoming something new without a higher being at its centre, without an entire civilization organised around the containment of something that most of its people have never been told the truth about. This ending offers not resolution, but possibility, not comfort, but the harder thing, genuine hope, the kind that doesn't guarantee the future but refuses to surrender it. What is consistent across all three is Hornet, her clarity, her refusal to look away from what she can see, her presence when presence is what the moment requires, her precision and her guardedness, and the complicated grief of being someone who belongs to many places and completely to none of them, who carries so much and asks so little, who shows up even when no one asks because she has decided it matters and she does not need anyone else's validation of that decision. She is, perhaps, the most complete person in this whole universe of beautiful, broken, complicated people. The night is powerful and moving, and has their own particular kind of fullness, but it is a fullness expressed through action rather than through articulated interiority. The design of the vessel required that silence, and the silence is correct for what the night is. Hornet is different. She has a voice. She uses it. She expresses herself through what she says and also through what she refuses to say, through the precise quality of her presence at the moment she chooses to be present, through the choices she makes that she does not explain because they seem to her to require no explanation, because when something is necessary and she's capable of it, explanation feels beside the point. She is the daughter of a queen who traded her future for Hornet's existence, and the daughter of a king who built something beautiful and destroyed it trying to save it, and the heir to a weaver tradition that learned the hardest lessons about consciousness and freedom, and what it means when the thing that made you also wants to own you. She is someone who grew up at the intersection of multiple inheritances and made herself out of all of them, rather than choosing only one. She's someone who guards things that are already lost because the act of witnessing matters even when the outcome has been decided. She is someone who arrives in a cage in a kingdom she has weaver heritage in, but no personal memory of, and decides, without anyone asking her to, that she's going to climb toward the thing causing the damage and see what can be done about it. She is Hornet, and she is enough. Let your thoughts go gentle. Let the edges of them soften. You don't need to hold on to any particular thread of this story anymore. The whole of it. Grandmother Silk and the Weavers and Hera's sacrifice and the pilgrim songs and Lace's complicated freedom and the citadel rising into clouds that never clear. All of it can simply exist in the background now. The texture of this night's company, something that was present with you as you move through these quiet hours. The silk is woven. The needle has been set down for now. Somewhere in Pharloom, in the aftermath of whatever Hornet chose at the summit, the kingdom is beginning to be something different from what it was. The pilgrims still walk their roads. The songs still echo through the corridors of the citadel, but they mean something different now, or nothing, or something that has not yet been decided. The weaver's patterns are still in the walls, still readable to anyone who knows the language of silk well enough to make the shapes yield their meaning. And Hornet is wherever she is, carrying whatever she chose to carry, free in whatever form freedom took for her at the end, resting perhaps, the way even the most precise and determined of people eventually must rest. She rests when she can, and so do you. Your body is heavy in the particular way of a body that has been awake long enough and is now genuinely ready to let go of wakefulness. Your breathing is slower than it was when we started. The thoughts that were moving quickly through your mind have slowed into something more ambient, less demanding. You are in the threshold, the place between waking and sleep that some people resist and some people welcome, and that always eventually arrives regardless of your preference, because the body's need for rest is not optional, and all the stories in the world are told in its service. Let yourself cross that threshold. Let your breathing find its deepest, easiest rhythm, the one that takes care of itself without any oversight from you, the one that moves air through you while your conscious mind is doing something else, or doing nothing at all. Let your muscles finish releasing whatever tension they've been holding. There's always more to release than you think. The jaw, the space between the eyes, the tops of the shoulders, the muscles along the lower back that have been quietly holding since long before you lay down. Let all of it go. Let the surface beneath you do the work of holding you, because it can, because it was made for exactly this. The stories will continue whether or not you are watching. Hornet will do what Hornet does. Lace will discover what freedom feels like when you've only ever had its opposite. The pilgrims of Pharloom will keep walking their roads. The night will keep moving through dark places and doing impossible necessary things without explaining themselves. And Hallownest will exist in its twilight, not fully alive, not fully dead, maintained in the memory of everyone who ever walked through it and cared about what they found there. You have cared tonight. That's enough. The silk settles, the needle rests, the patterns in the walls hold whatever they hold, and they will hold it through the night and through whatever follows the night, patient and old and woven in by hands that knew what they were doing even if they couldn't always name why. And you rest. Good night. Good night. Sleep deeply, dream gently, and when you wake, carry something quiet with you into the morning, something threaded in during these hours, something that came with you from the corridors of Pharloom and the dark of Deepnest, and the high, cold air of Hallownest ruins, and the very long, very complicated, very beautiful story of a woman with a needle and everything in her hands. She made of it something worthy, and so will you. Sleep now, rest, let go.